morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. This is the morning after the vice presidential debate. We were up late watching and reacting to it.
Thank you to our makeup artists, because there's some dark circles under these eyes today.
There's a lot of stress on this face that they do an excellent job of covering up. We're now going to get to reactions to the debate. There were a lot of them. The mainstream media certainly had a bunch of things to say about that debate that occurred between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance last night. Many, myself included, say that Vance scored a pretty significant victory. Let's take a look.
There is no doubt in my mind, however Governor Walz did in terms of sincerity, that Vance won this debate.
Does Governor Walz have a problem with the truth? No.
They were talking, at one point, Vance wanted to correct something about how Haitians got into this country. And he was right, and the moderators wouldn't let him correct it. It's very interesting.
But at the beginning, the two issues driving the campaign right now are Harris has a big deficit on the economy, Harris has a big deficit on immigration, and Republicans were happy tonight and Democrats a little bit nervous that on those two issues, Vance carried it.
J.D. Vance is much more experienced at this, at public speaking, at defending himself, at pivoting.
It's the audacity. I agree with you that we're in year 9 and no one knows how to cover the audacity. The audacity is that someone should have said, stop it, stop. Are you effing kidding me? And they should have dropped that F-bomb, right? I mean, they should have just, this is a debate. This may be the only chance people have to see the difference.
Don't really understand what she was saying there. MSNBC's Joy Reid voiced a fiery defense of Walz's debate performance. That's hardly surprising. Let's watch.
A smooth lie is still a lie.
Yeah.
J.D. Vance is incredibly smooth, but he said, number one, nothing memorable. There's nothing clippable in what he said. They were just all smooth, bland lies. He got outdone by Tim Walz, who may be awkward. It took him a while to get warmed up, but he won the debate because he actually had substance. He was relatable, and he didn't go in there to slay J.D. Vance. He went in there to show himself, and he showed himself to be bipartisan. He showed himself to be reasonable.
Practical.
He showed himself to be practical. He acted as a governor. And a lot of people are complaining that he didn't knock J.D. Vance out and that he wasn't rhetorically cruel. But that was not his job. It was obvious that his job was to sell Kamala Harris as president. He did that very well. He won the debate.
But swing state voters seemed more impressed with J.D. Vance's performance. The Washington Post polled a group of such people. Majority of them said Vance won the debate. So, you know, I'm not surprised to hear Joy Reid running cover for Walz's performance, but it seems like most people had the same takeaway that we did, that regardless of what you think about the candidates and their policy positions, Vance is more experienced at this and was rhetorically very gifted, and I think has benefited from doing a lot of media, including a lot of hostile media interviews in the last few weeks. He's done more than Trump, Harris, or Walz put together. And, you know, Walz was sold as someone who's good on camera and can do a good job in, maybe not in debate situations, but at least in interview situations. And I think he should have done more media to get himself ready for this kind of thing, even unfriendly media.
I don't know if it was about more media. I mean, listen, I think he's great in the media regardless. I don't think either one of them knocked it out of the park. I do think Joy Reid had some very important points to make. J.D. Vance was measured, sure, but he was still saying the same crazy stuff that he's been saying while he's doing that hostile media, the same crazy stuff that Donald Trump has been saying. Maybe he's not, you know, insulting people to their faces. What J.D. Vance had to do, he didn't have to hit a home run. And neither did Tim Walz. But he didn't hit a home run. It wasn't an amazing debate. They were decent to each other. There were no attacks against each other, very minimal tension. But, you know, for debate standards, he didn't overcome some major hurdles. He basically said what he wanted, when he wanted to. He didn't insult anybody. He wasn't, you know, cuckoo express like Donald Trump is. But he didn't have to hit a home. He just had to show that he was a little bit more likable than he was the day before, because he is the most unlikable vice presidential pick of all time. And that's what they were facing. They needed to show that the Trump campaign has somebody who can be a little bit more charming, can talk to normal people. And Walz, on the other hand, had to keep that image of being the folksy guy, because a whole new portion of America was going to see him. I think what was the problem with Walz was he was nervous at the beginning.
He was incredibly
nervous at the beginning. He warmed up, But by the time you're at the end, how many people have tuned out? I mean, that's when I think Vance started getting a little crazy, when he started to, like I said last night, getting into QAnon land, when he was denying the election. He wouldn't admit, this was huge.
He didn't deny the election.
He wouldn't admit that Donald Trump lost the election. He said, I just want to move forward. This is the man who's in this position because when the January 6th rioters stormed the Capitol, they wanted to hang Mike Pence. So he's in a really difficult position right now where he has to balance the truth with not going against the base that he needs to turn out, who might turn on him. And that's just the reality of the situation. Tim Walz, I wish he'd push back a little bit. I think he could have pushed back a little bit. I know he trained with Pete Buttigieg. You know, Pete Buttigieg is great in the media. I don't think he's, known for debates. I mean, we'd be better to train Tim Walz.
Pete Buttigieg does do, however, interviews with adversarial media. He does interviews on Fox. I think that's an important thing, and it shows. Walz was so nervous, he tripped over his words a couple times. Much of the debate, the first sort of 70% of it, was heavily about immigration and how that affects the economy, how that affects housing and healthcare and other issues.
Well, that was framed by Vance. That wasn't the question. Anytime Vance was asked any question, he would say, it's the immigrants' fault. It's like, why are your potholes not filled? Immigrants. Why don't you have healthcare? Immigrants. Why do the immigrants? And of course, he was fact-checked to that. I mean, if you could get that QR code moving.
I could not get the QR code to work.
It.
In fact, I think they conceded it didn't work because eventually they put on screen. Actually, just go to cbsnews.com, which is what I suggested in the first place, that no one wants to point their, I almost swore, their phone at the camera to pull up the thing. But look, I think the pivot to those issues was effective, because they're the number one things that people care about. And look, do I agree with all of the solutions J.D. Vance is proposing? No. I think there are trade-offs between having high levels of immigration. If immigrants are coming in and are swamping the social services in parts of the country, that can have a negative impact on small communities, as is clearly being felt. But also, immigrants are part of the workforce, and we will make things more expensive if we start wholesale shutting down productive sectors of the economy. Will actually make things worse. So there's a tension between trying to fix the immigration problem that people are so concerned about and lowering the cost of goods and services, which is also the other complaint. So there are trade-offs, is what I'm saying. And I think J.D. Vance addressed these things pretty substantively and pretty intellectually. And J.D. Vance, Tim Walz was often saying that he agreed with Vance. They were saying that they agreed even on the policy issues, on having sterner, or more strict, vigorous border enforcement. They agreed on doing more for unions and for labor. Tariffs are going to remain in place to some degree, regardless of which administration is in power, because Trump did them, Biden continued them, and now they're going. Although Vance knocked Kamala Harris for not being as in support of them as Biden is. There was a lot of commonality on policy, actually.
Well, they would start at that point. I mean, that's what they both trained at. They're like, I like you. And when, J.D. Vance acknowledged that Tim Walz's son, who had witnessed a shooting, I mean, J.D. Vance stopped in that moment and showed a human side to him, which is what he really needed to do. They are inverse of each other. J.D. Vance has this issue where he keeps getting caught on camera not knowing how to communicate with human beings. And on the other side, you've got Walz, who's not a professional politician. I mean, he's a politician, but he's not,
He's a professional. What do you mean?
He's not a
professional. He's been in politics for 20 years.
He has, but
he
is not, he's folksy. He's not used to being in these he's not a national name. The folks who want to rise up to the top take this path. They get the media people, they get the trainers, they get all the stuff. And Tim Walz just never went that path. He was just, he rose up in a very organic way, which is quite lovely, I think, that you don't have to hire all the strategists and the consultants and the media people who are going to make sure that you get your appointment. Pete Buttigieg.
There's some hostility there to Secretary Mayor Pete.
I just don't think everyone keeps saying he's so great in the media.
I'm not
and I'm like, this guy should not have been in charge of debate. You get someone who trains in debates. That was the debate strategist. And honestly, and that's the person who criticized Tim Walz's debate was David Axelrod, and David Axelrod picked Pete Buttigieg. Like, come on, guys, hold some accountability. Where does the buck stop?
Look, I don't find either of them I mean, this is not surprising because I don't really like political figures as a category of people. I don't find either of them particularly relatable. I think the purported folksiness of Tim Walz is a little bit of a performance. I find him kind of hectoring and mean, but
mean.
That's I don't find him likable at all.
Oh, well,
maybe
we'll
that's
be voting
just me.
for him.
What?
I think he's lovely.
Well, tell us what you thought of the debate and whether the media is getting it right or wrong. Obviously, we had a video last night reacting to some of the moderation choices, which you're not going to be shocked to hear I was not a fan of at all. I'm probably going to have more to say on that later this week. But we've got a lot more topics to get to on Rising. Stay tuned. More coming up. Iran's missile attack into Israel and Israel's invasion into Lebanon has many wondering what comes next. The U.S. came out firmly in support of Israel. Let's listen to what Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, had to say.
Obviously, this is a significant escalation by Iran, a significant event, and it is equally significant that we were able to step up with Israel and create a situation in which no one was killed in this attack in Israel, so far as we know at this time. We are now going to look at what the appropriate next steps are to secure, first and foremost, American interests, and then to promote stability to the maximum extent possible as we go forward.
The Pentagon also said it helped Israel and fired about a dozen interceptors at Tuesday's barrage of Iranian ballistic missiles fired at Israel. The U.S. has military spread throughout the region. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian defended the attack, calling it a, quote, decisive response in defense of Iranian interests and citizens. Here with us to walk through the fog of war is Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, Trita Parsi. Thanks for joining us. So,
thank you.
An alarming turn of events, but there were similar strikes that occurred in the springtime of this year that really didn't lead to anything. Is there really anything different about this moment, given that we are still post 1 year in now since the attacks in Gaza and in Israel by Hamas? How has the tone differed in just the 6 months since the attacks happened in the springtime?
These are very different attacks because what you saw here was that the Iranians used completely different missiles, hypersonic missiles, and the video footage of it itself shows that they penetrated Israel's air defenses, what appears to at least half of those missiles. They were targeting military sites, and this is part of the reason why we don't know that much about the damage that these missiles did, because at the end of the day, the Israelis use military censorship and do not allow reporting on how much damage was done, how many people died, etc., on these different sites. And it may very likely be that no one actually got killed. But this is very different. In April, you saw them shooting about 300 projectiles. The vast majority of them were really slow-moving drones. The vast majority of them were shut down. 9 missiles went through the Israeli air defenses. This time around, it seems to be quite a number higher than that. The Israelis clearly admit that this was something quite beyond what happened in April. But what is also a bit worrisome is that the Israeli politicians are talking about this as the greatest opportunity they have had in 50 years to transform the Middle East. So you have a country that has been attacked by 200 missiles, of course, after itself has been killing scores and scores of people in Lebanon and Gaza, and then sees the attack as the greatest opportunity in 50 years to escalate matters further. That's why this is such a dangerous situation.
We heard last night from Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance that he would support Israel's right to strike Iran further. If the Democratic side of the aisle disagrees, they certainly did not say that in explicit enough terms for me to understand that they have some different policy. Is there a chance that Biden is going to, rein them in to any degree? Do we even know where Biden is or what he's doing or if he's awake? These are very frightening moments for global security and world peace, and I am not seeing that we have an administration with any tendency to engage in restraint.
I think you're quite right, Robert. I think it's actually a very legitimate question, as comical as it may sound, as to whether anyone is at charge at the White House. You had a situation in which first the White House leaks that the president is really fuming and angry that the Israelis escalated in Lebanon. And then 2 days later, you have a report in Politico in which two White House officials in charge of Middle East policy apparently were encouraging the Israelis to do the very same escalation that apparently Biden was fuming about. Now, what this does is that it actually has more or less killed the confidence that America's allies in Lebanon, the very same entities that hate Hezbollah, that are really on bad terms with Iran, they feel utterly betrayed. They don't want their country to become the arena for yet another Israeli invasion. They believe, perhaps against all wisdom, that the Biden administration was actually trying to prevent that. And then later on, after Israel strikes Lebanon and what is considered a success because they took out Hezbollah, the White House comes out and says, actually, we were secretly supporting and encouraging Israel to do this. This is a situation in which people everywhere are asking themselves, who's in charge? And does it matter? Because it doesn't seem like this administration is in the habit of actually telling the truth about these matters.
Well, leaks often happen to papers, and Politico is often a gossip paper as much as it's a newspaper. Unnamed sources can have. I don't think it's going to determine the policy or how our allies approach the Biden administration. I mean, he has been in talks. This is a Netanyahu problem, correct? But with that being said,
no, it's not.
It's not a Netanyahu problem?
I would have to disagree with you.
Really?
I would disagree with you respectfully.
He is not listening to anybody.
Without a doubt, Netanyahu is a problem. I don't disagree with that at all. But to try to say that the United States does not have leverage, that the president of the United States cannot say no to Netanyahu, I think is just fundamentally wrong. And it's fundamentally a disservice to the U.S. itself to accept such a notion. And even if Biden had said no and Israel didn't listen, then we could perhaps say perhaps Biden couldn't stop it. But how do we then explain that since October 7th, we have given Israel billions and billions and billions of dollars of weapons, political support, diplomatic support, to do all the things that we apparently say we don't want them to do? At that point, it's no longer feasible to say that this is a Netanyahu problem. This is as much a Biden problem.
Well, I agree with you on that, for sure. But we should absolutely be cutting off the supply chain to Netanyahu, who's using it as at his own wit. I mean, it's his way right now, and it doesn't seem like, especially after the UN conversations, I mean, we are not even a few days after he spoke before the UN, and there were all these backdoor meetings to try to facilitate some sort of ceasefire or some sort of calming down, to the point where we even thought Iran was trying to de-escalate. And here we are 2 days later, 3 days later, after every single report was saying Iran didn't want to get into this, and here they are. So what was it in the last couple of days that changed, Iran's at least public persona when it came to de-escalating the situation?
I think that's a very important question. And I would point to three things that I believe caused the calculation on the Iranian side to change. One is that Jared Kushner came out with a very long tweet in which he essentially praised the Israelis for the assassination of Hezbollah, viewed it as a masterful success, and essentially said, here's an opportunity now to transform the Middle East. And I'm sure the viewers of Rising is quite sensitive, as they should be, to any language coming from Washington politicians talking about transforming the Middle East or any other region outside of the United States. What Kushner essentially was signaling that, or the way I think it was read in Tehran, is that the Trump camp viewed this as a success and as something that should be pushed forward further by taking the war all the way to Iran's own doorsteps. Then you had Netanyahu issuing a video message purportedly to the Iranian people, but it was in English with English subtitles, in which he essentially said that there will be regime change soon in Iran. He had issued similar videos to the Lebanese people before he bombed Lebanon, similar videos to the people in Gaza before he bombed Gaza. That, I think, added the Iranian conclusion that Israel was actually about to attack Iran anyways. And then finally, the realization or the added evidence that despite all of the talk that Biden is trying to prevent escalation, he actually is not doing that. At least some of the team members he has at the White House seems to be encouraging Israel to do so. And as a result, unless Iran strikes back, the narrative will be that Iran is now a paper tiger, Hezbollah is lost, and as a result, it actually is rather cost less for Israel to escalate matters further, and the U.S. should be on board with that. I think the Iranians reacted in order to change that narrative and reassert the idea that any war with Iran would actually be extremely costly to all sides.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And here we go, in Elon Musk's version of Batman. California Governor Newsom is the one playing the Joker. Elon Musk compared Newsom to the Batman villain after Newsom signed legislation banning local governments from requiring voters to present their ID when they go to vote. Musk wrote, quote, "Wow, it is now illegal to require voter ID in California. They just made preventing voter fraud against the law. The Joker is in charge." Newsom's new laws in response to Huntington Beach's controversial voter ID requirement, controversial to some, which was passed by residents in March.
In other Newsom news, the California governor vetoed a sweeping AI safety legislation that would have been the first in the country to place strict guardrails on AI. The bill would have required powerful AI models to undergo safety testing before being released to the public. It also sought to hold developers liable for severe harm caused by their models. Plus, it mandated a kill switch to turn off AI systems in case of potential biowarfare, property damage, or mass casualties. Explaining his veto, Newsom said in a statement, quote, "I do not believe this is the best approach to protecting the public from real threats posed by the technology. Instead, the bill applies stringent standards to even the most basic functions, so long as a large system deploys it." Newsom also said the bill was, quote, "well-intentioned, but does not take into account whether an AI system is deployed in high-risk environments involving critical decision-making or the use of sensitive data." Google, Meta, Microsoft, and OpenAI had all opposed the legislation, claiming it hurt innovation and would ultimately slow down the U.S.
New York Times claims that the waves of recent vetoes from Newsom shows he's actually more centrist than those on the right like to portray him. The Times points to Newsom recently rejecting warning labels on gas stoves, that's good, and free condoms in high school. I wonder whose idea that was.
The Times further says Newsom is treading on thin ice as Republicans have sought to attack Harris by bashing her home state.
So I do think that Gavin Newsom has been trying to shake the perception that many have of him, especially many on the right, as him being this ultra-liberal governor. Maybe he's thinking of a future run for higher office at a later juncture. Now, of course, Elon was upset with him over the voter ID thing. That's very par for the course, is Democrats vetoing such measures. Of course, voting illegally is a crime, but it's important to conservatives to show ID, and I see you smiling at me, so you probably have some views on that.
Well, first off, I don't think Gavin Newsom has changed much. I think he's always been pretty center-left. Just follow the money. Just see how people take donations. With that being said, I like him, and I think he'd be a great presidential candidate for the future.
I don't like him because of COVID.
Of course you don't like him because of COVID. I mean, I don't love that he went and had dinner at a fancy, one of the best restaurants in the country during COVID.
While we were all trapped, shut in our homes.
You were trapped.
When he had personally chained the padlocks on the parks, he's off dining at what was the place called? The French Laundry?
Yes, the French Laundry.
Which doesn't actually sound like a very elegant restaurant, but it's...
Yeah, San Francisco food scene's very nice. But, okay, with that being said, the voter ID laws, it came out of Huntington Beach, a city council, a very right-wing city council, and it basically would have made it so that all these different municipalities, I think there's 100 or so different charter cities, that have, they would all have different set of voting standards and that they would oversee them. It just was a bad law. Also, with that being said, 13% of our country, not because they're illegal, not because they're trying to like cheat voting, because that's what people want to do with their time, 13% of the country does not have access or the finances to provide the documentation in some cases to receive their IDs for voter ID. It's just a bad law. We know every single report, the Brennan Center, we have so many different reports at this point that show when there's election fraud, it's usually because someone's trying to overturn the results, January 6th. That's the result. I also find it hilarious that Elon Musk is so concerned with valid identification, the man who lets millions of bots occupy Twitter and boost his arguments. The guy doesn't care about valid ID. He cares about his opportunistic
I think he cares
agenda.
About illegal immigrants voting.
He doesn't. He is an immigrant.
Well, he's not an illegal immigrant.
No, now he's. Oh, and many of these people aren't either. That's the.
Well, then they can show ID. What's the?
So if you're
crazy,
elderly,
I have to show ID. You have to show ID to buy alcohol at the bar.
Tax.
It should be.
It's a poll tax. You don't have a right to drink alcohol.
What are the ID?
You have a right to vote.
In all circumstances, it's just wrong to ask for ID.
That's a different question.
Why when it's for our elections?
Because it's an inherent right, and every single good governance organization that focuses on electoral.
Okay, next time I get pulled over on the highway, I'll say, I know I have an inherent right. I'm not going to show you anything.
That's not, you don't have an inherent right to drive. You have an inherent right to vote. So if you're elderly, if you were born, it's not as often anymore, but you were born in the South, the record keeping wasn't strong. If you're elderly, it's hard. It's hard to keep up with your ID.
Look, I hate going to the DMV as much as anyone else, but if it's important to you to vote, I think the burden is on you.
I'm going to tell you a little secret, and all of our viewers. I have an ID from college that doesn't expire till 2049. I live in New York City. I'm a resident of New York City. I vote in New York City. I pay taxes in New York City. Everything. It's for over 10 years, and I don't have a New York ID card because I don't drive in New York. And I tried one time, and I went to the Bronx, and I waited in line for 3 hours, and then they told me that I had to bring 4 proof of identification. I just moved my apartment, and it was all based on your previous expenses to get an ID card. So this is how difficult. I gave up. I said, I'm not doing this again. I had 3. I had 3. I did not have enough.
Okay, let's talk about this AI safety bill, which I am glad he vetoed because I don't like the idea of putting the government in greater control or limiting the reach of this technology. I think we will fall behind our global competitors if the federal government or the state government or anyone stifles important research and innovation being done here. I don't at all trust them. What they want to backdoor encrypt all of it so the government can spy on us. Technology is liberating us, is finding ways to get around the government's desperate need to control us at all times. So of course they're reacting poorly to that.
But you trust Microsoft and all these big companies, Meta, more than you trust our governor?
Yes.
I just disagree with you. I disagree with you. This is why we have laws.
That doesn't mean I trust them. I said you should trust more.
You trust them more, really? I don't trust Bill Gates. I don't trust this right-wing libertarian, Silicon Valley, ecosystem of boys that all have their agenda. They want to take over the world.
And what? And faceless government bureaucrats don't have an agenda?
Of course they do, but they're
well-meaning public servants. You
can hold them accountable. You can't hold these guys accountable.
Actually, it's harder to hold them accountable. You can hold these people accountable by not using their products and service. And there's tremendous market disruption in the tech sector. No one is king. You say, oh, this is an unbeatable monopoly, and then there's some new company that comes along and kick them. There's been so much of this person is in this company is in this unbeatable position, and then remember Yahoo search, all that. It just changes because there's so much innovation and competition in this sector. It actually works. Where there isn't innovation and competition is in the overseers and the regulators. And I think it's the worst idea ever to have some government commission in charge of the pace at which these technologies develop.
I think
it's not about trusting the company. It's about knowing that if they do a bad job, there are market checks, or if something else that's better comes along, and they're responsive to that. Yeah, they're not responsive to our opinions. They're responsive to the markets. But that gives us more power than we have over the faceless bureaucrats who are tweaking social media in ways we would have never even known if Elon hadn't purchased Twitter and pulled back the curtain a little bit and shown the exhaustive level of communications between federal agents at every department and the moderators at Twitter. The moderators under the previous leadership, who even they thought most of the guidance they were getting from the government was BS.
Jack Dorsey picked Elon Musk to take over Twitter in his own little coup. So, they're all in cahoots. But I think what we're leaving out here is that you trust a robot to make decisions about national security. I mean, there are real issues here in terms of biowarfare. I don't trust the market to make a decision. If that were the case, we wouldn't have clean water. If that were the case, our skies would be cloudy all the time with smoke and smog. You have to trust government to regulate some things.
Yes, public spaces need to be. I mean, I'm in favor of tragedy of the commons, where no one has clear decision rights over public space. You end up having a lot of it not being taken care of well. So I'm for actually transferring as much of the public space into private ownership as possible, such that the people who actually own the space end up taking care of it. But to the extent that we need to have public spaces, yes, of course there's going to be some rules consistent with the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights for what happens in the public space. I'm not saying there's going to be no regulation, but you're talking about private technologies and innovation that is being done all over the world that I want us to be a global leader in. I mean, the reason that America is so important and so dominating in terms of its tech sector is because we have better protections for speech-related technological innovation than they do in Europe or China or South America or anywhere else. And that's a good thing. And we should be zealously guarding that.
I think one of the reasons why America is so ahead of everyone else in terms of technology is because the government funded the internet, and it was a project of the government. And when we actually fund those institutions internally, we grow even more. Now, if the government wanted to take control of AI, I would say there are more standards and they can be held accountable, where it's very hard to hold Elon Musk accountable and these private companies accountable, and you don't know what their agendas are, and there is a monopoly situation. Lena Khan addresses this. You know, she talks about how these monopolies have been buying up all these smaller innovators to kill them because they want to innovate internally. This is not a world where it's a competitive marketplace anymore. We're in Web 3.0. It is not. It's so hard to start a startup nowadays. When you do, they get eaten up by Google, or, I mean, do you want to start a competitor to Google? Good luck. You know nobody uses those competitors.
Google came out of nowhere and beat the previous competition. It could happen again. Look, if they offer a product that gets outcompeted, look, it's not easy to do. I'm not saying it happens every day, but there is more creative destruction in this sector than in any other sector of the economy.
I would say healthcare.
I mean, look at the top 10 tech companies, like year over year, over time, over the last 15 years. They change like crazy.
Yeah, because they're eating up all their competition and stealing their...
It's not just that. It's not just that.
Well, there definitely is a monopoly of power, and I don't trust that much power in the hands of a few that have very little accountability to anybody besides their board of directors and maybe if they're publicly traded. Maybe. That's not really democracy, in my opinion.
You tell us what you think. We'll have more Rising right after this. We have heard the mainstream media assert that crime is falling, even though many Americans believe it's actually getting worse, that America is becoming a much less safe place. Take the city of Chattanooga. A new Manhattan Institute report finds that Chattanooga, like many cities, did have a violent crime problem that was mostly brought under control. Yet polling confirms there's still a widespread perception that crime is on the rise in that Tennessee city. Manhattan Institute fellow Charles Fane Lehman says that disorder in the city, including public homelessness, trash, and drug-related violations, are partly to blame for this perception. Now, he writes that while Chattanooga is focused on bringing down violence, they've done so at the expense of other issues in the city. He says a similar pattern is emerging in Washington, D.C., where we are, where signs show that disorder is rising.
Lehman acknowledges disorder is hard to define, but some examples include retail theft, unsheltered homelessness, or public drug use. Charles Fane Lehman joins us now to discuss perceptions of crime and how they measure up to reality. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. I know you're very knowledgeable in tracking the statistics on crime, and so I wanted to have a more nuanced conversation about what's actually going on in American cities and what can be done to fix things. Over the long-term trajectory, right, we all know that there was massive amount of violence until about the early 1990s, and then there was a collapse in the violent crime rate for the next 2 decades or so. But in the last few years, some of that decline was reversed in some cities. There was a lot of crime during COVID, and now in a lot of places we've brought that back down, but it's not perfect everywhere, and Americans still feel very unsafe, like things have gotten a lot of worse. And I never want to tell people that their perceptions for what their communities are like are wrong, but that's what we do hear sometimes from some media commentary on what the actual situation is. So, what is your analysis of what's being done correctly to bring crime back under control, but how there's still this public disorder that has not been addressed?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to be straight about what kinds of crime we are talking about. In the summer of 2020, co-occurring with COVID and also the riots and protests following the murder of George Floyd, there was a large increase in certain kinds of crime, in homicide, in aggravated assaults, which is a proxy for shootings, and in car thefts. It's really that increase in homicide and aggravated assaults that's been coming down, sort of spiked dramatically over 2021, 2022, and then has been receding. And there's good evidence that we're close to or potentially back at 2019 levels. So that's a really big win. At the same time, you saw, particularly in large cities, an attrition at the level of police officers. Cops were retiring. Cops left for smaller departments. We can get into why that is. I think there are a host of factors. But so, my argument is that what happened in a number of cities, what I've identified in Washington, D.C., what I've identified in Chattanooga, what I suspect has happened elsewhere, is that police forces that were operating with less capacity and saw an increase in interpersonal, particularly gang violence, that was driving this increase in shootings and homicides, responded by focusing more limited resources on just that. And they seem to have, in many places, succeeded. Not everywhere, not all the time, but that's a reliable strategy. But that strategy comes at the expense of dealing with more minor crime. And so in DC, for example, I have shown that there was a dramatic decline in enforcement around minor offenses, as much as a 99% decline in certain categories like prostitution arrests. That yields an increase in the level of ambient, what we talk about as disorder. And that increase is, in turn, I think, driving a lot of the perception of crime, that people sort of talk about crime as this amorphous bubble. And so they're surprised to see that the homicide rate, a thing that they're usually not exposed to, is going down, because in many ways they are much more exposed to crimes that are less serious than homicide, but are still deserving of attention and are not receiving the attention that they need, in part because of more constrained resources.
So you mentioned a few things that I find fascinating here, and I'm glad that you get into the details of what a crime is and the perception of a crime. Also during the pandemic and the couple of years afterwards, I live in New York City, and I think this happened all over the country because so many people were, staying at home. There was a rise in domestic violence, and that, of course, was homicide violence too. It was a different type of homicide than, say, gang homicide violence, but that went down also, and that was the majority in a city like New York City. With that being said, you said there's a perception of crime. So homelessness, okay, if you're staying in a location that is private, perhaps you could say that's a crime. But homelessness in general is not a crime. But it could make that perception. If you're in a safe city, New York City and many cities across the country are safer than they've been, as Robbie said, in the last several decades. Maybe there's an uptick, a slight uptick, but there is a rise in homelessness in many cities too, but that's not a crime. Someone might feel unsafe because they see homelessness or people who are unhoused and do not have mental health support. But is that necessarily a crime, or is that what's making people feel uncomfortable? And the media plays it up and politicians play it up.
Well, so I would say a couple of things. One is that descriptively, public camping or other acts antecedent to unsheltered homelessness are criminal acts, right? You can't sleep on the streets of New York. It's not legal. That is a crime. But I think the sort of broader point is that it is not a crime perhaps in the same way that homicide is. It's not the same thing that we would talk about there. It's not what we call a major crime. It might be a minor crime. And there are other things that are in this category as well. Shoplifting, what we talk about as retail theft. There is some measured increase in felony, i.e. major shoplifting, but there's also an increase in minor shoplifting, people just taking stuff. That is a crime. It is larceny. It's larceny. That is not a major crime in the same sense, but it is much more prevalent, right? Minor crimes are by their nature much more frequent. And so I think we are much more sensitive to changes in the level of those minor crimes. I don't want to, though, sort of capitulate to the framing that these are sort of not criminal problems or not problems in which the criminal justice system can play a role in addressing, because I think that they are problems for the way in which people live together in cities and the quality of life in cities. And I think they have to be taken seriously as such.
Well, a couple of things. Homelessness is not a crime in New York City. There's a homelessness bill of rights in New York City, and I think there's several other cities who have that as well. Second thing is a lot of these statistics in terms of theft from stores were being, it was notorious. There were plenty of stores that shut down their storefronts claiming that there was criminal activity there, but turns out they were fudging their numbers. They were fudging it, and it was really just a decision from the top to save money, and they were using theft, petty theft, as an excuse. Now, was there probably some? Sure, but it wasn't at the rate that they were claiming, and that was exposed in research.
I mean, here in Washington, D.C., right, Union Station for a while had to shut down. This is the beautiful-looking train station in the nation's capital that at one point during COVID had a shanty town on the front lawn of utterly disgusting tent community and deranged homeless or semi-homeless people wandering the train station, threatening people. And so Starbucks and a bunch of other businesses all pulled out of the area, and you had this, just total disorder-related collapse of this valued piece of a public space. Now they've finally paid attention to it and they've fixed a lot of it, and businesses have come back, and it's much nicer than it was 3 years ago. But I think that goes to show that if there is an utter collapse of trying to attend to, again, not like homeless people who are victims of poverty and are not really bothering anyone, but people who are homeless and also mentally ill and drug addicted and flailing about in the streets, does cause a problem.
Yeah, well, and again, I really want to emphasize sleeping in public is in basically all jurisdictions of the United States illegal. It was not in the Ninth Circuit for a while under certain conditions, and the Supreme Court has said that no, really, you can prohibit it, which is different from being homeless as a category or class. But this gets back to the point about like behaviors in public, which are problematic. There's categories of the homeless. And to get to Robbie's point, I think that many of these petty issues have gone unattended, related to shoplifting. You can look at municipal crime data. It shows in individual cities increases in reported shoplifting, instances of shoplifting, not just sort of like claims by companies, but the actual level of shoplifting. The question in my mind is, what do we do about those issues? Because I think people rightly say this is not exclusively a problem for the criminal justice system, that we shouldn't just sort of like round up all the homeless people and incarcerate them for many, many years. That's not a good solution. We shouldn't incarcerate petty thieves. But I think until we sort of say, look, there is a real disorder problem, there's a measurable disorder problem, and this is a problem, this is a thing that people have a right to be concerned about, we can't talk about sort of what are reasonable, effective, evidence-based solutions, which cover the gamut of interventions.
I understand what you're saying. However, I take issue with criminalizing homelessness, and in many cities they have decriminalized it in past measures. And that, again, is not a crime. Maybe there are some people who are unhoused and need mental health support, and that is what the country should be doing, is providing that. But instead to be looking at it through the lens of how do we get rid of these people, how do we deal with this criminal issue, rather than saying how do we support and find housing for unhoused, how do we provide more mental health care. I'm curious why your approach is more from the lens of it's all crime versus how do we create support systems that would prevent a lot of this from happening.
Well, so this is not an either or. This is a both and. You sort of move beyond the particulars of what is and is not a criminal offense. It is both the case that when you're dealing with an issue like unsheltered homelessness, you want to think about how you can shift people into shelter, how you can provide people with services, and also that much of the source of the problem is noncompliance. If you look at a city like DC, the levels of homelessness have declined steadily over the past decade. The levels of unsheltered homelessness have increased in the same period of time. The problem is not an absence of shelter beds. The problem is that people prefer to sleep on the street, and there are few consequences for sleeping on the street. Similarly, compliance with treatment for serious mental illness is a combination of carrots and sticks. There are great programs that exist in the city of New York for providing treatment for people with serious mental illness. They struggle to connect to that population, in part because the population is transient. They don't want to be constrained. So I think my view is not we should exhaustively view this as crime versus we should exhaustively view this as sort of an issue exclusively for this population. My view is that we have to regard both of those things as we should regard as legitimate concerns, both the needs of those individuals and the needs of the community. We have to prioritize both of those things. We have to address what are the underlying problems, where the underlying problem is not just somebody is seriously mentally ill, but also somebody's behavior is disruptive to and dominating of the public space in a way that should not be tolerated, regardless of who they are.
One other thing I wanted you to address before we go is that I know I saw a lot of people online reacting to the most recent national crime data and saying, well, actually, if you look at it closely, it's not even counting so many certain large cities. And I saw you on X had a response to that wasn't completely right. Can you explain what the actual portrait is in terms of those most recent? That was the FBI statistics, I believe.
Yes. So to try to make a complicated topic as simple as possible, In 2021, a bunch of cities didn't report because the FBI was moving over to a new reporting standard and they were not in compliance with that standard. In 2022, the FBI said, okay, you can report under the old standard and we'll count you. So there were real problems with the crime data in 2021. Those problems do not obtain in 2022 and 2023. I think that in general, the trends that show up in the FBI data are correlated with reality. And you can say that this is true based on not just the FBI data, but by going and looking at individual city data. You can aggregate data. A friend of mine, Jeff Asher, runs a thing called the Real-Time Crime Index, where he's aggregating data from over 300 cities, and the trends look exactly the same in his aggregate as they look like in the FBI's data. So I think that signal is real. And I think it is much better use of our time to talk about why crime has declined rather than sort of saying, well, I don't think, the position that the data are fake depends upon the idea that 18,000 agencies in the United States are all faking their data, and then the FBI and all the state level departments of justice are compliant. I think that strains credulity.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Climate scientist, mayor, former terrorist? That's what Colombian President Gustavo Petro called Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's first female president. He said she once helped Colombia's leftist terrorist guerrilla group M19. Now, Sheinbaum is Mexico's first female president, and she took office on Tuesday. Petro, who once belonged to M19 himself, told reporters that Sheinbaum helped exiled rebels when they passed through Mexico. The terrorist guerrilla group spread chaos in Colombia in the 1980s, carrying out kidnappings, murders, drug trafficking, and other attacks. Now, her office didn't respond for our request for comment, and Petro's claim has not been verified elsewhere.
Sheinbaum is a lifelong leftist whose parents were leading activists. She backed her predecessor, former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's AMLO's initiatives and ran on expanding them, including overhauling Mexico's judiciary. The 62-year-old reached a second milestone as the first person of Jewish heritage to win presidency there, and the first woman. Here to discuss all things, Claudia Sheinbaum is staff writer for The Hill. Rafael Bernal, welcome. How much of a nothing burger or a big burger is this?
Well, Gustavo Petro is as reviled by his enemies as he is feared by his allies for his big mouth. He tends to go off. He's famous in Colombian politics for going off. It's a pretty big nothing burger in the sense that sort of social support for the pan-Latin American left in Mexico City in the 1980s was pretty much a given for someone in Claudia Sheinbaum's background. I don't imagine this at all meant her, carrying an AK-47 or sending money for weapons to Colombia. And in any case, when she became a student activist, it was after M19's most notorious terrorist attack.
So Petro was, however, a part of this group, has admitted to being part of this group. So what is his relationship like with Sheinbaum that he's decided to make this accusation?
I'm not sure they've ever met before in person, to be honest. This is a sort of an extensive, it's just, again, back to this pan-Latin American, it was cool in a certain crowd in Mexico City in the 80s to support certain Colombian guerrilla groups, M19 among them. They were a very urban guerrilla group. Petro has been sort of mocked even for his, some people call him a Kashmir guerrilla. So it's unlikely that he really knows to what extent she participated. It is absolutely certain that she was among a group of leftist college students who formed an organization in the Mexican National University that very much supported movements like M19.
I mean, you said the critical thing here was there were a lot of movements at the time pushing back against the government in Colombia, and this movement actually became a party, a political party. So it is, in a sense, part of an institution that exists there, just as some political parties around the world form out of revolutions, pushback. So, I mean, I think of Bill de Blasio. When Bill de Blasio ran for mayor, they called him supporting the Sandinistas because he went down to Latin America. I mean, it was a great talking point. It's great for the far right to push back. I'm just curious, who is this supposed to resonate with? Is it supposed to resonate with Mexicans? I mean, she was clearly voted in with majority, and it's historic beyond measure. So who are they trying to sway? And furthermore, what is the vibe in Mexico right now? I mean, as she's preparing for her presidency, she just got inaugurated.
I mean, the first question, back to Gustavo Petro's big mouth. Like, I don't know who he was trying to sway. Yes, M19 became a political party. They disbanded in 1990, made peace with the government. They had this horrible incident in Colombia Supreme Court in 1985, which ended up with like half of the Supreme Court dead. And it was mostly the government doing the killing. But so that was a terrible incident. They sort of got over it. The vibe in Mexico right now is Claudia Sheinbaum's. She gave two addresses yesterday. In neither one did she even recognize the opposition. The opposition doesn't exist.
What opposition? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean those people, the 30% of people who voted for the opposition, might as well have lit their ballots on fire. So that's sort of the vibe. She is trying to be more of a. She had a very conciliatory tone toward, for instance, investment, both foreign and domestic. Much more of an environmentalist than AMLO. Much less combative. She was very presidential compared to him. He's always had this sort of casual vibe that the opposition hated, and the opposition, before her address, every lawmaker from the opposition that talked was really trying to sound conciliatory toward her, and she just ignored them.
Wow.
What is her relationship going to be like with the American president, if that's Kamala Harris, if that's Donald Trump? Obviously, immigration is the top issue on voters' minds. It's going to be very important for the next administration to work with Mexico to come up with some fix to our problems here. What is that relationship likely to look like?
So Claudia Sheinbaum's presidency is, I'm 99% sure, going to be defined by the results of the election here. It's two very different scenarios. Mm-hmm. If you have two women heads of state, sort of from the left-wing parties, whether their left-wing credentials are great or not, but from the left-wing parties in North America, renegotiating or reopening the books on the USMCA in 2026, that is one scenario. And in that scenario, for instance, there will be a lot of talk about the environmental bits of that treaty. If you have Claudia Sheinbaum, who is sort of very straightforward, serious, no jokes kind of person, dealing with Donald Trump and keeping immigration at the forefront for the next 4 years, the first 4 years of her presidency, you have a completely different scenario. And who knows what happens in 2026. So the Mexicans are very concerned, especially not so much about the immigration stuff. They think they kind of have a handle on that. They're greatly responsible for the reduction in crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border. They're very concerned about the USMCA in 2026.
Mexico is a complicated state to lead. I don't think any president, leader has been able to avoid having to deal with the cartels. AMLO just shoved a judiciary reform that some say is going to empower the cartels more. Can you explain a little bit about this reform and why it is significant, and also just how Sheinbaum perhaps has to maneuver that, given all of the other growth that's happened in Mexico? There's still the violence of the cartels, and a mayor was just killed, was it yesterday or today?
Yeah, I mean, political violence in Mexico, which really hadn't been a problem since the revolution of 1910, 1920, is over the top. The reform, the basics of the reform is all federal judges are going to be elected up to the Supreme Court. So that is a huge change. They had a meritocratic system for judges. That, oddly enough, that was the one part of the judiciary that did work, was a selection of judges. Anyway, that's gone, and the Morena party, Claudia Sheinbaum's party, AMLO's party, is going to have a lot of control over who gets to run. And voters are going to have very little control over who they're voting for, because they're going to have these gigantic ballots. And if down ballot candidates in this country feel a little bit ignored by the voters, like the district judge in Mexico is going to be like, nobody's even going to know their name, like who they're voting for. They're not even going to care. So there's going to be a lot of political control over the judiciary. The question is, and this is Sheinbaum's biggest challenge, is she's left with a lot of control, a lot of power in a country that's become deinstitutionalized, that's become really dependent on the party in control, on the government party. The question is, will she control the party or will AMLO control the party?
And how do they relate with the National Guard and the cartels? How are they going to be able to?
There's less evidence of direct contact between Sheinbaum and the cartels than there has been between AMLO and the cartels. Whether that will work in her favor is still in question.
Rafael, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
We have more Rising coming up next. Pope Francis condemned Israel for its aggression against Lebanon and Gaza, pointing to the force used in the targeted assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. Speaking in an in-flight press conference over the weekend, the pontiff said that Israel has a domineering tendency, further adding, quote, a country that uses force to do these things, I am talking about any country, to do these things in such a superlative way, these are immoral actions.
The Pope declared all wars are unjust and a crime against humanity, arguing that morality must be upheld even during times of war. His sentiment echoes his 2022 remarks about the war in Ukraine, calling for an end to it in March, a month after Russia invaded it. Though he didn't call out Russia by name, the Pope's criticism of the war has increased. Israel has not responded to these latest comments from the Pope, but in July, Israel issued a statement condemning the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, it is the Pope's role to call for global peace, world peace, consistent with Catholic or Christian or religious philosophy in general, but obviously the situation is complicated by the fact that the participants want to engage in war, at least in the case of Israel and Hamas, and
they don't answer the Pope.
Israel and Iran, and they don't answer the Pope, but he is right to call for peace. I hope peace prevails, but it goes both ways, and both sides and belligerents need to seek peace.
I think this Pope in particular needs to be very careful because he is a different type of Pope. He's portraying himself, he's a Jesuit, he's a more progressive leader in the Church. The Catholic Church historically has not taken positions like this. So he has to be a little bit careful because let's not forget, roll back the clock, when the Catholic Church and the Red Cross facilitated Nazis, they transported Nazis to South America, in Argentina in particular. I mean, Evita Peron, the famous Evita Peron, went to the Pope, went to the Vatican, and orchestrated this deal. And several Nazis, there's so many books have been written about this at this point, moved to South America in facilitation with the Red Cross and the Catholic Church, and he should know that. So, beyond this rhetoric, right, there's also an undertone that could be perceived through the Jewish community that he is not representing their interests.
Well, I mean, the Church, many Catholic priests and Catholic leaders sheltered Jewish people, stood up for Jewish people during World War II. I don't know that, I mean, I'm raised Catholic. I'm a sort of lapsed Catholic, I would say, and obviously the Catholic Church has a very complicated history, and it is certainly not all to the good, including in recent times. But I would not say that the Catholic Church has a Jewish problem.
Well, I'm saying that the Vatican itself. So yes, there are individual churches. There are individual churches, there are individual Jesuit priests,
as well.
But the Vatican itself facilitated this. All I'm mentioning is another layer to this current, which it's not just that the Pope is speaking out against war, it's that the Pope is the head of a church that had some real issues with the Jewish population, one generation ago. So it's something to keep in mind, and I'm sure Netanyahu's very aware of this, and it could be weaponized. So if I were the Pope, which would be a very weird position to be, I would make it very clear and overly clear that this is any sort of atrocities. All war is bad, as he said. But
although under Catholic morality, there is just war theory. Like you are not obligated to do nothing and stand motionless as you are killed if your people are invaded or attacked, as the people of Ukraine were by Russia. Right. Now, I agree that we need to have peace, and in fact, I think we should be pushing for peace, even if that means Russia claiming some kind of, or taking some kind of victory so that they stop invading the country and killing everyone in it. I'm for that, but you do have a right. It's not, if you're attacked, you can, and then this is, what gets tricky about the Israel situation, is that they were attacked on October 7th, 1,200 people killed, people dragged from their homes, taken prisoner by a terrorist group. But of course the Palestinian people have the right to feel aggrieved by how Israel has treated them. And then Israel will say, well, we did those things because of the things Palestinians did on X, Y, and Z occasion, and then they can say, but before that, we did that. Like, this is how it becomes impossible to resolve these things, because you can always point to previous actions by the other side that you are saying you are responding to. And what partisans do, I've noticed now, and I will throw this out there. I think the left does this sometimes. Maybe not you specifically. You can always, and the right does it too. You can always reduce the agency of your own side and thus make the other side feel more guilty. Say, well, they're only doing this. The other power, be it Russia, the Hamas, whoever it is, they're only doing it because in response to our actions, which were bad, and that's usually true. But then you can also say, but what were our actions were a result of some bad action that they took. And what people will do is cut off the agency and say, no, we are the U.S. and its allies are the prime actors and movers, and everyone else is just helpless but can only react to what we do. And they have no control over how they handle things. It's just us. But of course, that's a very simplistic way of viewing.
I think you're totally right on this. And that's why people who say the Mideast is simple, it's not. It's incredibly complicated, and we should understand that to the point where a basic complication is Netanyahu obviously propped up Hamas and is very much benefiting from this situation and using it to his advantage.
Not a conspiracy theory has been clearly demonstrated 100%. By mainstream reporting.
Including reporters in Israel who've reported on this for over a decade. With that being said, he's also using this as an opportunity to leverage Israel and U.S.'s relationship to take on Iran, of course. What I'm curious about with the Pope is, what are you going to do about it? You're the Pope. I love how he's presenting himself as this peaceful figurehead, but the Catholic Church is incredibly powerful. And yet, it's like he wants to sit in the shadows. Why don't you offer some sort of peace talks? Why don't you invite these leaders and have a conversation at the Vatican in some safe space? Maybe it doesn't go anywhere, but at least do something. If you want peace, you can't just call for world peace. Oh, we're going to do a prayer every Sunday and we're all going to call for world peace. That's great, but that's also like Marianne Williamson saying we're going to meditate on world peace. It's a good thing. It's not a solution.
I mean, Catholics believe that prayer, not just Catholics, Christians, people of other faiths believe that prayer is an important thing you can do, and it's sometimes really the only thing you can do.
But he can do more, is what I'm saying. Okay. Maybe it's the only thing we can do, but he can do more.
The Pope.
He is in charge of one of the most powerful institutions in the world, historically, throughout time, and continuing today.
Well, I would like to see everyone call for more peace and work toward that, and that would certainly be a good thing. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks for tuning in. It is, only Wednesday? So we'll be back here tomorrow. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll see you later. Still hoping for some sunshine in the District of Columbia, maybe one of these days. See you later.